It's a pleasure being here. This is my first time at Bletchley at all, and I'm seeing some equipment here that I did not expect to see. So I was there in the early days of Silicon Valley stuff coming up, but this stuff predates it, and it really is the history, the beginning of computing in general. So it's just a pleasure for me to see that and from my humble beginnings. So let me talk about my humble beginnings, how I got to do this thing. So here's a picture of me at home, and I'm in junior high school at this point, and my father signed me up for an RCA correspondence course in radio and television, well, radio repair. And fortunately, across the street from where I lived in the Haight-Ashbury, right there in a corner, near the corner of Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, before it got colorful, the neighbor across the street had a television repair shop. And I got to go down there, and I learned a trade, how to fix radios and televisions, which later on actually helped me pay my way through school, through Cal. I got into Cal because I was a football player, fortunately, and quit after the first week, decided my future lied in electronics, not in hitting other people. I wasn't that big. But I was at Berkeley at the some interesting times. So here's a picture of me, the front page of the Berkeley Daily Gazette, getting a haircut, a free haircut on a Monday. And what it was we were protesting the war in Vietnam, and we generally felt that looking like a hippie, long hair was dangerous. So this was a suicide prevention thing. But I was shocked when I walked down the street. They closed the place down. The union guy came and closed the place down shortly after that picture was taken. But I was famous at an early age. So, and I fixed televisions on campus, which I was able to pay my way through school. I also I got a job at Ampex. Ampex is a company that invented videotape recording and audio tape recording. And I learned a lot about how televisions are supposed to work as opposed to my repair job, is how they really worked. So I learned that, and the stuff I got at Cal taught me the serious engineering, the real stuff, computer science. And so I just had all the right mix of education to make this a fairly trivial, easy job. The computer in the background is it's not really a computer, it's a videotape transport that we were storing documents on videotape, high resolution documents, and that's one of our technicians that was there doing that. So Atari came out, when I was at Ampex, Nolan Bushnell was also at Ampex at the same time, and several other people that we used to start Atari were there, so that was good. But Nolan himself, University of Utah, he graduated last in his class. He was not the best engineer, but he was an engineer. But he ran a pinball arcade at a big amusement park near Salt Lake City in the summers. So he understood that business of how people put machines in locations, how they collect the money, how it works. I didn't know that. And University of Utah was one of the few schools that had a PDP-1 computer that ran Space War. And of course, Nolan, goofing off, would go over there and play this Space War game on the computer. That was the only way to ever see a video game at the time. So he said, gosh, if I could put a coin slot on that, we could people would play it, and we'd make a lot of money with that. It'd be something new. Of course, the problem was it was running on $1 million computer, and that was not going to work. But he had this idea, and so here he is at Ampex working on that videotape recorder, and he had a partner in his office, office mate, Ted Dabney, and Ted encouraged Nolan to go try to build this thing. And the trick was, we didn't have a computer. The display was totally wrong. It would cost, you'd lose $5 every time somebody put a quarter into this thing if it worked. And Nolan figured out how to make that game of the Space War game, flying around a planet, how to make that work on a regular television set. It's called a raster scan television, which cut the cost out of it. And his wife was going to buy, he told his wife to buy a Supernova mini computer, which was a few $1,000s at the time. And we didn't really have that kind of money. And she never bought it because they didn't have the money. She refused. And by the time, and the computer was so slow in those days, it really didn't help that the video rates. By the time he expected the computers to arrive, which they didn't, he had designed out the computer, done everything in digital electronics. So now all of a sudden he had created the first video raster scan game. It was in a coin-op cabinet, and that started. It did not do very well, but hey, it was a start, and he did it for another company that was in the area because he was just an engineer. They had manufacturing. They distributed to the coin-operated business, but he had, and we had a small game route. He got the money from the money that they got for the royalties for that game. They bought some pinball machines and put them in the local bars around. That was great because that gave us cash flow. In those days, the arcade was considered an evil place. This was an early arcade, and so we had trouble getting financing. Venture capitalists would not talk to us. It's the way you're supposed to do it, is get money from venture capitalists. They wouldn't let us in the door. The banks wouldn't even give us a line of credit. We had a checking account, was the best we could do with the banks, until a year later when we all of a sudden we were making real money. And now Wells Fargo Bank advertises the fact that they helped get Atari started, which I find pretty ironic since it was, anyway. So that was from the arcade. And then here is the Space War game being played by some real computer scientists, where not, obviously not our arcade things. You don't wear suits and ties in a video game arcade. But that was the beginnings of the game. And there's the mini computer. The emerging technology, mini computers were around, and they used the TTL, which was transistor logic. They're little chips. In volume, they cost about 50 cents a piece. They're very high speed logic. And so that was I could do a lot of stuff with those things. People often ask me, well, what program did we have for Pong? Well, I asked them what microprocessor would I have used, because there weren't any at the time. And so a lot of young up-and-coming engineers can't conceive of a game or a useful thing being built without a microprocessor. But since I don't really do much software, this worked out great. And there was a couple other, so the TTL was there, and the monolithic voltage regulator, I put that down because that was actually one of the harder things to do. It seems very simple, but a lot of people got that wrong. And the first 10 Pong machines that we sold had an outside store-bought voltage power supply in a little frame, and it had a little adjustment screw on it. You could get the voltage just right. Well, the problem was we were selling these machines to arcade operators that are used to pinball machines. They had a big file and a big screwdriver, and here's this delicate thing, and if the thing wasn't loud enough, if it wasn't making enough money, they'd start turning knobs until it got better. Well, you turn the voltage up on the regulator and you just wipe out the whole board. So that didn't last more than 10 things, and we got a single chip voltage regulator that there was no adjustments, and that helped to make the thing work. This is the team that brought it to you. On the left is Ted Dabney. He was the guy that shared Nolan's office. He was not a digital engineer. He was a non-degreed hardware engineer. He's an old man by our standards. I mean, we were all under 30, and he probably was over 30. And he had to leave. There's Nolan with his polka dot shirt and bright tie. There I am with lots of hair. and a pencil in my pocket. You could tell I'm the engineer. And this gentleman was Fred Marinchek, and I'll make it very brief, but he was our first financial officer, and we basically caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. So he left. So the only two there are me and Nolan that survived. This is the world headquarters where Pong or Atari was started. It started out as Syzygy Company, S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y. Stupid names, but it was great for Hangman. 3 Ys. So I have somebody figure that one out. And so the next choice was Atari, and Nolan liked to play the Japanese board game Go. And I think Atari means something like check in that. Anyway, it was a good name, worked, did us well. So Nolan hires me, and he's a real carnival barker. He's going to get the best out of people regardless of what it takes. So he tells me when I get there, and I'm 24 years old, I've got a couple of years of experience working for Ampex, and he tells me he has a contract from General Electric. Now there's just 4 or 5 of us in the office. The secretary was a gal, Cynthia Villanueva, who was Nolan's babysitter, and she'd come after high school and sit there, and was instructed that if anybody called for Nolan to make him, he was right over there, to make him wait and seem like we had a bigger place than we did. Nobody from General Electric ever called, came by, or wrote us a letter, any of that stuff. It didn't occur to me that this is all BS. And what Nolan was doing was giving me a challenge. He wasn't just saying, get some speed up, you do this. I'm going to give you the toughest project, a home version of a video game, which meant it had to cost, parts had to cost 20, 30 bucks. And then nobody ever came by or talked to us or wrote us a letter. It didn't occur to me. But he gave me the simplest possible game ever. In fact, it's so simple, it's in the press lately that they've got a few disassociated brain cells in a petri dish to play Pong. So, it's got to be pretty simple. And I'm the man. It's got one moving object, the ball. It's got 2 paddles, and it's got a net, which are dots down the thing. It's got the score digits and sound. That's it. And so the fact that I was getting too many parts in this thing, it was kind of like a failure. I had like 70 chips in this thing. And I was saying, this is not going to work. And Nolan didn't seem to care. And as he described it, it was not fun to play because it was 1 speed. So I added speed up, I added the angles off the paddle and a few things. And there were a few mistakes that worked out real well. One of them was the paddles would not go up all the way I had designed the circuit. And I was going to fix that later, but I discovered that would have been deadly if I fixed it, because by having that little gap there, a good player could win. 2 good players could play the game forever and monopolize the game, and that would be a failure. So having that error there, so I never fixed it. So my attitude about engineering is, if you can't fix it, call it a feature. And then the score, I had a chip from Fairchild, the Fairchild sales rep, Jerry Lawson, came by. I had this beautiful little chip that made the most beautiful characters on the screen it was easy to implement. And I showed it to Nolan. He said, oh, that's really pretty. How much does that chip cost? Oh, $5. He says, nope, you're not going to use that. And I had to make the square ones. It took about a week of thinking to get that done. That required some thought. And then at the end, I said, okay, it's done. And he said, well, where's the sound? And I said, sound? I've already got too many parts in this thing. And he says, what do you want? He says, I want the roar of a crowd of thousands when you make, I said, how do you do that digitally? I mean, I could do boops and beeps. And so I figured, I'll be right back. So I went over a couple hours and I poked around the video circuit, the vertical sync generator, and found tones that seemed right, gated them out with a little timer. And I said, there it is. And if you don't like it, Nolan, here's the wire wrap gun. You go do it yourself. Okay. Later on, there were articles written about how wonderful the sound was and how clever it was. It was just like, there it is. Don't waste any time. We didn't have a lot of time or any money. So And that's the prototype. So at the bottom, you can see underneath the television, it was Hitachi. What I did was I went to the drugstore, the Walmart, the Walgreens or whatever, and bought a $75 Hitachi television. And armed with my experience fixing televisions, I was able to repurpose the television as a monitor with sound coming from the speaker and the video, and it was cheaper. Motorola sold a beautiful chassis mount monitor that they had, if you remember back in those, if you're old enough to remember back in the 70s at airports, they had these horrible monitors that were green and they were never working, and they could sell that for $300. Or I could buy a Hitachi out of the drugstore for $75 and it looked better. So that's how that came about. And so I built it on this chassis. If you can see it down there at the bottom. That's not shown on the video. That's too bad. Well, anyway, it's on the bottom, and that's just, there's the black thing in the center is the power supply with a knob, but I could adjust it, and the rest of it is a wire wrap, very loose, wires strung all over the place, very fragile. It really wasn't meant, and we had the sophisticated attachment for the TV set, which was a stick wedged in to hold it in there. And so Nolan said, and we put in the Pong name, Nolan and I have argued about that once I was at a conference, and they said, well, who came up with the name Pong? And I point to Nolan, and Nolan points to me, and we didn't know. It had to have a name. It was short, sweet, so there's Pong. That's the thought. And it had that coin mechanism on the side, on the left side. That's a laundromat coin mechanism. Very important, because we didn't have any place in the cabinet for that. This was thrown together over a weekend. So all of a sudden, this thing was working as sort of an arcade, you know, it was coin operating. So we went to our favorite location because we had these pinball machines. We had a route, and our best location was Andy Capp's Tavern. And they had barrels there, and we put this thing on top of a barrel, and Nolan and I got a beer, and we watched somebody two guys put a quarter in the thing and played it. We said, what'd you think? And the guy says, oh yeah, it's a pretty good game. I know the guys who did that. And we go, really? And I said, we'll save the BS for the girls. Okay, fine. So anyway, after a week or so, the machine stopped working, which would not surprise me because it was never meant to be out there. You just shook it, you could break it. So I went out after work to go fix it, and the first thing you do is you open up the coin box to give yourself a free play, because you're not going to waste a real quarter on this thing. You made it. So I opened the coin box up, and the thing was so full of quarters it wouldn't take any more. They just fell out. So I picked the quarters up, split the take with the owner of the bar. The next day I go into work, and I dumped this sack of quarters on Nolan's desk, and I said, well, I found the problem with the Pong. It's making too much money. And he goes, throwaway, huh? Because he thought the game he was going to make was a driving game or something really complex. All of a sudden, the simplest game ever conceived is making money. Now, why did it make money? I think part of the fact was, even in the real arcade implementation, like you saw in the picture with the upright and a nice cabinet, we had very simple graphics. It wasn't male-oriented. We didn't have women in bikinis on the side. And it was something women could play with men and be equal. So you got a lot of interaction there. And I think that was one of the reasons it was successful. It certainly wasn't planned. This is just what happened. But that's the prototype, and that is at the Computer History Museum today. They were going to throw it away. Atari was in the garbage, and we got it out of the garbage can, and I saved it. So we had some challenges. We had no money. Banks wouldn't loan us anything. The VCs weren't interested because we were in the mafia, and we had to get cabinets made. And fortunately, just lucky, in Santa Clara, not far from our headquarters in Santa Clara, was a company called P.S. Hurlbut, which was a big cabinet manufacturer that was going out of business because they just had, for whatever reason, they didn't have a lot of business. And these guys were really good, and they were able to co-design the cabinet so it was strong enough to withstand shipping and moving and stuff like that, and they had a good price. So boom, we had cabinets. We could get monitors. from Hitachi, sort of directly, but that led to that guy getting fired for taking kickbacks on the monitors. Yeah, so we were lucky to get that going, get all the right parts. The first product was pretty crude, but it was such a hit that, let's see, we started production. That's the board, the actual electronics in there. That object on the lower left is the 5-volt power supply with no knob at all, and the rest of it is just chips. It's all digital, and the outputs go to a TV set, which is all analog. But putting it all on one circuit board was an innovation that I did. Previous designs used to have little plug-in cards and interfaces, and I hated that. I just said, how big can you make the panel? And like, how many chips can I get on that thing? And that's how that got done. The $75 black and white set, and we had a bread pan to take the coins, which wasn't the best way to do it. But basically the machine sold, there's the brochure. The machine sold for around $1,000, and it cost us about $700, $600 to make. And again, we had no equity, we had no investors, but the machine all of a sudden became so popular that people would pay for it cash in advance. And that was a good deal. And we could turn inventory. I learned that phrase later. Coming from Berkeley electrical engineering, they didn't verboten to learn about business, but turning inventory was how fast can you're just having inventory sit there, you waste money. We were turning inventory in 2 weeks. We would get the cabinet in, the TV set in, get the board in, boom, get cash for it. And so we just had retained earnings. We were making $200 or $300 per Pong as fast as we could make them. Unfortunately, well, they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but people were copying. They would just, because the board was so simple, you could just get the board, and the people making the board were making extra boards and selling them to our competitors, and you could put the parts in, stuff the parts, and boom, you had a Pong game. So we had lots of competitors. I think we made about 3,000 Pongs, and the industry made about 10 or 15,000. Yeah, Nolan said he wanted to make 100 a day, and I figured, you're nuts. We did. So we had to create a manufacturing organization around that, and that caused some grief to get that working, because we didn't know. Again, we're just a bunch of naive engineers. In fact, Nolan went to the unemployment office to get workers. And you got a real cast of characters and trustees and reprobates. And so it was quite a character, quite a three-ring circus. And we had an old roller skating rink as our manufacturing floor, and guys were running around on skateboards carrying parts across. If OSHA had seen what we were doing, it was nutso. But we had great parties. Now the thing, so these people were copying or stealing our stuff, but the one thing we could do that the copiers couldn't do is we could make the next game. And so that was it. That was the way so about the time they flooded the market with the copy, we'd make a next game, and I did 2 games myself, Gotcha and Space Race, which weren't terribly popular, and we did many variations of Pong. And by that time I had to hire other engineers, and I'm 25 years old, and I'm hiring real engineers that are older and wiser than me. So that took a little getting used to, because most people feel threatened by that, but I realized, what the hell, I'll see what happens. And met some very interesting and very clever people. And what happened also was we were so busy fighting fires in manufacturing that how do I design the next game beyond those 2 games? So there was a couple of engineers that left Ampex about the same time we did, went up into the Sierra Nevada mountains in a little town called Grass Valley, old gold mining town, and they had an operation set up called Cyan Engineering, and they were our advanced development. They wound up doing games like the Grand Track driving game, which is very complex, and the VCS, the 2600. They invented that, and I could not have done that And I learned how to work with people that were smarter than me and not be afraid or intimidated, because many people don't like that. So what's next? There it is. So this is one I'm going to have to read to you. The way Nolan managed. This is a memo. We were called Atari at the time, but we still had syzygy letterhead left over, so we used that, and we had a cheap copier, and whoops, I flood the place. So this is from engineering to engineering, from Nolan Bushnell. I'm engineering, he's Nolan the boss. In accordance with the concise business plan, the following is the charter for engineering. We didn't have a concise business plan, but let's just say we did. 1, have a minimum of 4 acceptable production-ready products by December 31st, 1973. This is April of 73. We're barely a year old. Okay, have a bunch of games ready. So are you kidding, Nolan? Have a design and manufacturing for Chicago type coin door, because we needed a coin mechanism. The bread pan was not going to work. That was ridiculous. Have sufficient staff that at least one engineer can be assigned to emergency projects without upsetting major production, because Nolan would get these emergency ideas and he'd rip a guy out of engineering and there goes a real game. So we wanted that. 20-player gotcha. A packaging for Dr. Pong. He had the idea that he could sell a free play version of Pong to doctors for $1,000 that they put in the waiting room so the kids could play. Doctors are cheap. I mean, I love them. Some of my best friends are doctors, but they're not going to spend that kind of money, so that didn't work. It said, then item 6, packaging and a printed circuit board for a color modulated consumer Pong. That's an industry. Item 6, that's a whole new industry. Custom chip, everything. It's item 6. Okay, and develop staff to provide documentation manuals. We didn't have any of that. And a booth for a trade show at the same time out of engineering. And then he says that every effort should be made to develop adequate staffing to handle this workload. We didn't have a lot of money. And statements concerning our manufacturing capacity, because I said we don't have any, are unapplicable to the above design schedule. Nolan Bushnell. Okay, so I write back to Nolan from engineering, in accordance with your memo dated August 3rd, 73, will statements regarding our financial capability be applicable to the above design? We had no money. And Nolan writes on the thing, no. Just so, okay, off we go. And that's when I went off and I figured, okay, this is crazy. I've got my number 2 guy, Steve Bristow, made him the vice president of engineering for coin-operated stuff, and I went off and did this consumer stuff. I had never done a custom chip. I didn't know how to do it. I did hire an engineer previously who did know how to do custom chips, and I was going to have him do a custom chip for our arcade video games to stop the copiers, but that didn't work. And he said, I think we could get Pong on a chip. And I said, let's do it. This will be fun. I'm going to learn something. I'm probably going to fail, but let's see how far we get. Well, all of a sudden, we did it. We got there with my wife did the wire wrap for the prototype. Harold will do the logic design for the chip. And he had a Calma design computer we rented time on to lay the chip out. I would check the schematic that he would draw, fix that. Katie would wire wrap it. I would then debug that, fix the schematic, and then we went on and eventually we had a good schematic and we get the chip in and he plugged it into the fixture and it worked. And it was like a dog chasing a car. What do you do if you catch it? We had no plans. There was no consumer. Silicon Valley at that time was really 2 industries, the semiconductor industry and the military, Lockheed, and those guys were down there. but there was nobody doing consumer stuff. And all of a sudden we had a consumer product that was going to be the hot product. And we didn't have any customer, we had nothing prepped in accordance with the concise business plan and bullshit. So, we called Sears. Sears and Roebuck was a big retailer in America, had a catalog, and we got that big building in Chicago. Yeah, Chicago. So we called Information Chicago, get information at Sears, and the lady, the receptionist that answered, was kind enough to look in the catalog and see that they were selling the Magnavox Odyssey game, which was a very crude home video game. They were selling that in the catalog. And so that was in the sporting good department. So they patch us up, and the buyer happened to be in. The one guy at Sears or anywhere that knew the value of that product more than we did, we got a hold of. Because Magnavox thought they were in the business of selling big television sets, and they only sold the game to get people to buy the TV set, trying to tell them it would only work on their television. And so when we show up, we tell them we got one, you can put it anywhere you want. He said, well, next time I'm out in California, I'll stop in and see you. Well, 3 days later, he shows up on our doorstep in Los Gatos, wearing a suit and tie, looking proper at 8 o'clock in the morning. None of us were. And he looks around, and nobody's over 30 in the company. It's pretty wild. But we had the game, and he saw that we did. But this was going to be a hard sell to management. So anyway, we did. There were some great stories where we tried to. I remember I was on the 37th floor of the Sears Tower with the marketing guy, and I'm trying to play the game, and it goes through channel 3 or channel 4, one of the TV channels. And I had a TV set from Sears there on a stand to wheel in. I had the prototype working, or trying to get it to work, and it couldn't work. It wasn't working. It turns out they broadcast from channel 3 on the roof of the building. So I had to open the bottom of the thing up, retune the oscillator to get it to work on channel 4. I got it in there, and the execs at Sears saw this, and we did the demo, and Carl Lind, who was the head of the department, whose previous claim to fame was the air-conditioned electric blanket. Have you heard of that? Anyway, he looks at me and he says, Mr. Alcorn, you're telling me that you're going to get that little piece of silicone the size of your fingernail? You're going to make one of those? You're going to have the whole game on it? I go, yes, sir. He says, how are you going to solder the wires to it? I'm going, oh, Jesus, when I'm dealing with the wrong. So we eventually took them to a semiconductor plant when they came out, and we showed them how they put the wires on it. So anyway, that was funny, and it was wonderful because we knew nothing about the consumer electronics business, and it's really cutthroat. If you ship them 1,000 games and they don't sell half of them, they say the remaining are defectives. Even though they're supposed to be permanent sales, you get them back. There's all kinds of tricks they play. If you don't have another good game, they're not going to pay the last bill. And Sears was nothing like that. They just put a printer in our manufacturing capacity and printed labels where we just shipped the boxes, and they paid their debt on time. I even was watching Monday Night Football, and they had an ad for my game on television. And I go, wow, I'm on football. So it was a real exciting. And eventually we did. And then the next year, or that year before we sold that, we went to the toy fair, the New York Toy Fair, the world's biggest toy fair, and where all the products for Christmas are sold, and this is a Christmas product, and we showed the product, and I remember talking to vice presidents or buyers from Macy's and all the big retailers. We did not sell one machine, not one. And basically, the sort of was, well, we will, tell us how many you sold last year and we'll gauge from that. Well, we didn't sell any, so we're not going to buy any. So we were forced to have Sears as our only customer, which was the best thing that ever happened, because now we had enough money, and now we were making money, and we could actually get a venture capitalist would talk to us, and things started to change. But then Nolan decided to, he read a book on management, and the book basically said that the executives, the team that gets you to $1 million will not be this team that can get you to a higher level. So you need to put in a seasoned team. He brought in a bunch of B players from Hewlett-Packard, and they just about ruined the company. But we got the Grand Track driving game got us through that. How we're doing on time? We're running a little late, right? Okay. Anyway, we got venture capital with Don Valentine. The price, that was a funny one. We started talking to them at one point when we were having trouble coming out of our depth. They just waited and waited, and all of a sudden we had a price. We realized the price was too low, and the day of the sale, we said, oh, we just doubled the price. And our attorney said, if you do that and they say no, your venture capitalists will never talk to you. So we did it and we got away with it. I've already gone through that. And there's the prototype for consumer Pong, which my lovely wife wire wrapped, and it's a lot prettier and a lot nicer than anything I would do. The problem with that one was the case. This is a wooden case, a mock-up. I didn't realize, I thought the chip was the big problem, but the case actually took more money and more time than the wood, than the chip. So I learned that hard lesson. We got through. And I already talked about that. Oh, then we had the semiconductor company started copying our stuff. National Semiconductor, what we did for National, we just hired their entire engineering team. That stopped that project, General Instruments, and we just bought all the General Instruments parts up and threw them away. And then we did the Atari 2600, which is a microprocessor game based on the 6502 cartridge game. And I had Jay Miner and a good team, the best team in the Valley, designing that chip. We sold the company to Warner Communications in 1976. And after that, they did not introduce any new products. They kicked us out because we weren't East Coast Silicon Valley, East Coast people, we were Silicon Valley, and we just about, they kicked us out, put us on the beach. I was being paid not to show up, which I'm pretty good at. And then at one point, the Forbes magazine, the president from Warner, called Ray Kassar, was bragging about what he had done, and he called all the engineers just a bunch of high-strung prima donnas. So we had a T-shirt made within a week that said, we're just a high-strung prima donna from Atari, and he had to wear it. And then E.T. happened, and Atari died. So that was the story. And then Apple, but we don't want to go into that. I hired Steve Jobs for a tech, and he had this crazy idea for a home computer. Who'd want that? But we helped him get funded, and he offered me founder stock in Apple, which I said, nah, that'll go nowhere. I got enough wallpaper. I'll take a free computer. Anyway, and there's the application for Steve Jobs coming to work for me. He worked at, his previous experience was Reed College, which is a literary college up in Portland. And I said, is that an engineering school? No. But he was young, he was a hippie, he's cheap. So that's why I hired him, he's a tech. And he went on to better things, I hear. Then I got hired as an Apple Fellow. I don't want to go into all that. I think we've done the Atari stuff.
Great, thanks, Al. So I'm going to kick off with a few questions. So I'm going to be, people will look at you and think, I asked you this earlier, and it'd be great to get your response again, I think, which is, were you a gamer? What attracted you? Are you now, have you ever been into computer or video games to have worked at a company like Atari? Truth or dare? Come on.
Yeah, I'm not really much of a game player. The last game I really played hard was Pong, although I have had some other games. But I like inventing stuff, and I liked the challenge of how do you make this thing work in this industry, which has never been done before, disrupting an industry. And I've done a few of those, and it's a lot of that was really what I like to do.
Mm-hmm. So it's the problem solving, I think you said, is rather than and watching people play the games.
Exactly, yes, and what people play it, enjoy it, yeah.
What is it about that kind of, I suppose, excites you or intrigues you? Is it the intellectual challenge, or the use of your skills in solving these problems?
Because how do you make an image on a raster scan television do all those things? It's really really quite fun, the challenge to how do you do that and solve that problem. And I've solved other kinds of problems, like making a new slot machine that can't be cheated, stuff like that.
Well, it's interesting, I think, also watching the way you describe using the bread pan, for example, to collect money. I mean, these really were, how would you describe those days at Silicon Valley? I mean, we see it now as a place of process and components are shipped in bulk from people, and it's all kind of CAD-CAM and everything. I mean, you guys are literally getting household components like TVs, and you're wiring the stuff together. I mean, take us...
Yeah, it was like all very simple, very easy to make, and innovation doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be clever, has to be clever to solve the problem.
And was this, because you described Silicon Valley as basically being the hardware guys or the defense guys, was this a widespread thing people were literally making?
Well, it was great. That was a great advantage because we were the most fun place to work. So Steve Wozniak was working at Hewlett-Packard in the daytime, but he'd come over to Atari at night and play the video games on burn-in in the back room because he liked to play video games. So I had Woz around, friend of Jobs, and he was really there was a savant, a true genius. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that. That's also fascinating as well because you accelerated, became you went from engineering to manager quite quickly.
Yeah.
And you recruited some colourful characters like the two Steves.
Yeah.
You've described it as a bit like kind of managing or herding cats, I think you said.
Yeah. I mean, you want to hire people that they're willing to try new ideas and new things, and so these people can be a little tough sometimes to keep in line, and they're going to go off and do their own thing. One guy in particular I know, Owen Rubin, he's hired at Interval Research, and I warned him. I said, you got to keep him busy because if you don't, he will start his own project that's really, really good, but it may not be what you want. So just keep him busy, So it was each one had their own needs, and that's why I kept going back to engineering and doing the consumer because I really like doing bullying an electron, not a engineer.
And did that kind of, I suppose, inform or help the game making? Because you said there was this almost like this arms race of innovation in gameplay, wasn't there? If they'd copy you, then you could get ahead by...
Where you had to leap ahead to the next one. Yep.
Was that a reflection on your kind of, I suppose, what we might call today the engineering culture or the design culture? These brilliants who are a little bit dysfunctional? Yeah,
we tried, and for example, when they kept copying us, we tried to figure out ways to keep the copiers from copying us, engineering ways. And I finally learned that if you make something uncopyable, you will not be able to produce it yourself. So we kind of gave up on that and just came up with better games.
And I think it's interesting too, in that we talked about this offline, about it's a collective thing. It's easy to look at you and people think, oh, Al did this and Al did that. And Nolan gets a lot of the publicity as well. But it's a commercial collective effort, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's all about the team. There's no one person that did this other than maybe Woz. He was such a genius. But no, it was getting a team to work together productively to create something, and you had to make sure they were going in the right direction. They didn't go off on the wrong thing.
And what was it Woz did? You said you kind of like he coded something even smaller than you would, because you were set the challenge by Nolan initially, weren't you, by Pong, and you got it down to a certain price point and a certain number of components. But he took things a step further as well, didn't he? If you could just...
Oh yeah, he kept trying to do that, and he would keep going into the engineering lab. We were doing coin-op, and he'd look at a product underway, development, and he'd get bored with it and change it. So I had to put a system in where I'd get a pager call when he went into engineering, so I could go in there and undo what he did and set the thing back right again. And Nolan got so frustrated with that. He understood why I was doing it. So then he pulled the one guy out of engineering that I was not watching, which was Steve Jobs. And Nolan didn't know that Steve was not an engineer. And so he assigns him to do this game called Breakout. And Jobs said, sure. And what Jobs did was got his buddy Woz to do it, and Woz did it in about 2 weeks, and there was the game. But it was so brilliant, so beautiful, so concise. I couldn't understand how it worked. Nobody else could. So we had to redesign it later with 100 chips from 25 chips, and it was a hit game. But yeah, he had the right idea for the game, but the wrong person.
And do you have any kind of questions online?
Yes. Thank you. So one of our volunteers, Stephen Clement, has asked a question. He says, your story of making the sound by probing the circuit for a useful signal is genius. Myself and Alistair Frost spent the past few months fixing the museum's 1989 Atari hard drive-in arcade machine. Our analysis of the machine is that it was designed with a level of genius that does not exist today. And have you got any more stories like your sound generation? I think what you just said about Woz is probably a good example, but
Yeah.
any others?
Yeah. No, you just tried to leverage off of what you already had, if you could, to do it as simple and as cheap as possible, and making it complex, really, you know, it wasn't much fun. I like to do the simplest things possible. I'm fundamentally lazy. My wife could tell you.
And let's talk a little bit. Obviously, today there's a huge association, especially in engineering and technology, being very, I suppose, a male-dominated profession. And something at the museum we like to kind of encourage, obviously, is STEM, and obviously encouraging young girls and women to get into that. What was it like back then at Atari? Did you have much a workforce? Were women in the workforce, or was it all guys? And were there any notable women who worked at Atari back at that time?
In the early days, it was mostly guys. But we really tried to get women in, and the first one that comes to mind is Donna Bailey, who designed the game Centipede. And women liked it, had the right colors, the right play action, and it was very important because we want to get, that's half your market, there's half the population, and you want to get them playing games, yeah.
So Donna, she designed Centipede, or she built Centipede?
She designed Centipede, yeah, that was her baby, programmed it. It was back in the days of microprocessors, and she was able to program that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I guess was there a perception of games back then in engineering as being a male profession rather than a
well, the engineering primarily is, today it's getting more and more females in it. And especially when I was at Apple working, we did have a lot of women working there, yeah.
Yeah. And what do you think, you talked about sort of some of the successes that you had there, and there was a lot of games which you remember, and you mentioned the fact that Steve Jobs offered you shares in Apple, and you said no. We hear about the successful games. Were there any games that you maybe think which we didn't see? They never made the light of day, and you.
Well, yeah, we had one with custom chip. The guys that designed the custom chip for the two guys in the team, Bob Brown and Harold Lee, designed a thing called video music, which coupled your color TV to your hi-fi set and made a dazzling light show. The triumph of engineering. So okay, there it was. Wasn't on something we wanted, but okay, we got it. We'll do it. We put it in the box. We showed it to the Sears and Roebuck buyer, and he looked at it, and he was playing this in the Gata DeVito with the light show, and he, at the end of it, he was just stunned, and he said, "This looks like something that hippies smoking pot would play." And the engineer, Harold, here's the joining. Oh, Jesus Christ. Harold, no. So, and that we didn't, we ordered 10,000 manufacturing to make 10,000. Manufacturing looked at it and said, this is a dog. They made 1,000 and we couldn't sell those. And so they were given away in boxes to the engineers and whatnot. So yeah, that was a stinker. But the point is that even though it was a stinker, nobody got fired. And 6 months later, we introduced a game called 2600, which was a big hit. And so to be really innovative, you have to be able to fail, and to fail gracefully and say, okay, let's do something else, unless they're just bad people, you know.
And it's fascinating, I think, for people today to look at because you obviously, the heritage is the coin-op business, but there was a real transition, wasn't there, during that era into the console business? Oh, yeah. How did that kind of, I suppose, did that create any, how did that work out? Did the company feel, was it a smooth transition? Was it a jerk having to go, oh my God, the coin-op business is coming to an end?
When we're doing coin-op, all of a sudden, and I actually had the copy, the only business plan, this is before computers, it was hand-drawn, it was an org chart, all the coin-operated division, tests, manufacturing, sales, and here was the consumer division, all TBHs, all blanks except for the top, Alcorn, top, that was it. We had nothing, and a few people that were risky volunteered and wanted to be in that, and the other thing was I hired the right people. I felt that the guys that were doing coin-op design, we're keeping the company alive, and I don't want to take those engineers. They weren't the right engineers to do this stuff anyhow. So I actually had split engineering and have my own team to do it. And that was, I think, a wise decision I made, but dumb luck, I think.
Did you see it coming, the kind of the home console business, and did you see the coin-op business sort of its end on the horizon, or was it?
Well, no, Nolan always, from day one, it was innovative leisure. Most companies, like at the coin-op business, the leader at that time was Bally Manufacturing. They're still around, and they saw Nolan's early computer space, and they saw this is something clever. They bought a small investment. They had like a couple $1,000s a month contract to design some games for them, so they saw themselves as coin-op arcade manufacturers. We were innovative leisure, entertainment. And so we come out with this home version, and the Bally guys said, "What are you doing? They're not going to be in the arcade playing the games anymore." Right, they're playing our game at home. And because they made that mistake. They thought they were in the arcade. They weren't in the game business, they were in the arcade business. So yeah, that was Nolan. God bless him.
Do we have any more questions online?
Yes. So no mention of Jack Tyrrell.
Oh.
Jack Tyrrell.
Jack Tyrrell with. Are you talking about the guy who opened the computer store and sold the first, or is Jack Trammell? Jack Trammell.
Yes.
Ah, yes. He was the guy that Warner sold the remains of Atari to after the collapse in '81. And he ran it. It was a dark version of Atari. He had a very good product, but it just wasn't my kind of company.
You left in 81 or 82, I think.
Yeah.
What was the catalyst for you leaving? It stopped being fun.
Yeah. I remember when that happened. When he took over, I was at the bar, the Line and Compass bar, and Dennis Groth, who was our VP of Finance, was sitting there at the bar at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and I was out. I was on the beach, and hey, what are you doing here? Oh, I just got fired. So really, what happened? He says, well, I go to the office, and they'd rip the phone out of the wall because they didn't want to spend a penny more. So he had no phone to even call up his old customers and say goodbye. Yeah, that was a different kind of Atari. Yeah.
Dark place.
A darker version. Yeah. Oh well. Atari still lives, so the name still lives. And one final story: when Warner bought Atari, there's the East Coast, Warner Communications, movies, records. They got their advertising firm. They said, we're going to punch up the logo and all the present. So very proper Fifth Avenue advertising agency. They did a survey of what the perception was of the existing Atari logo and name, and they were surprised to discover that it had better name recognition than Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. And they said, don't change anything. That cost them about $100,000 to find that out, and we paid, I think, $2,000, George Opperman, $2,000 for the logo.
Yes, timeless.
That was funny.
Do any more questions?
I've got a couple more.
Cool.
We've got time.
Yeah.
So let's,
I'm sorry to take too much time.
hopefully they won't take too long. Although I now need to scroll back up again. Thomas Archer asked the question. He says, I'm a teacher, a cybersecurity teacher at New Century Technology High School in Huntsville, Alabama. What does Al recommend for students in high school to do right now to help them prepare for future jobs and careers that may not even exist today?
I don't know. I'd say study hard, get good work. This picture here that's up is a thing that we ran, Hack the Future. One Saturday a month, we get people, parents bring their kids in, junior high school age kids, and I teach them how to solder. Somebody else would teach them how to program Minecraft, how to do programs and stuff like that. And it's just mentoring. And I think that's, if you could find somebody, because that's what I had with my neighbor who was the TV repairman, was essentially my mentor. And if you could find a mentor that can work with you, that would be great.
Excellent. Dave O asks, apart from missing out on the home computer business, did you have any other big misses at Atari?
Well, we got into the home computer business. I personally missed out on a fortune by not investing in Apple, but Now, what happened at Atari, once Warner took over, they would not release any new product. Nothing. They were, I believe they were afraid that it might fail and it would make them look bad. So if you don't do anything, you won't fail. and I had actually developed, a holographic game, used holography, and believe it or not, we had to invent the embossed holograms you see on the currency and MasterCard. We invented that at Atari for a game that was never released, and we never bothered to patent it either.
The last question was, from Tony, says, I was always impressed by the EMC suppression feed-throughs on the Atari 400, and was that anything to do with you?
Oh, electromagnetic suppression. There was a whole big fight going on. When you build an electronic device, it has to be certified to not make noise, to interfere with other things like computers in the home. And nobody knew how to do it. The Apple II was so bad, if you ran the Apple II, your neighbors in the apartment building couldn't get their other stuff, their television, to work. And so we had figured out with the Atari 400 how to do that, the Atari 400, 800, how to do that on a computer. It made the computer run a lot slower, but we figured we're going to be the only guys that'll be approved. Well, the other companies like Texas Instruments had more suck than we did with Washington, and they got the regs loosened up so they could be in. It was like now, so that computer was probably a failure because it was a less powerful computer because it was quiet. But that was a learning experience.
The rest is history. I think that's about it. We've all got time for this evening. I think if we could follow up offline with some of the remaining questions, that'd be great. But all that remains is to thank Al. I mean, I'm looking at possibly Silicon Valley's closest to royalty here. So thank you for coming all the way from
Katie.
California. Yeah, take that home and deal with that. So thank you very much for dropping in with us this evening from California. It's been a pleasure. It's been great to see you after 10 years. I can't believe it.
Thank you for having me here. This is great.
Thanks, Alan.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.